Former Army Master Sergeant Elias Thorne had run out of road, his last $200 tucked into the cracked leather of a wallet that had been with him since Kandahar. He was 62 years old, his marriage a casualty of the man he'd become after the war, and his daughter's phone number was a ghost in a phone he could no longer afford to keep active. With his dying Ford F-150 and a retired military working dog named Buster, he bought the only thing he could, a derelict Boeing 727 sitting silent in a Mojave boneyard for $1,000 cash. He expected nothing more than a metal shell to keep the winter out, a place to finally disappear. But on the second night, Buster, the scarred Belgian Malinois who'd once dragged him from a burning Humvee, froze in the cavernous cargo hold, his deep growl echoing off the aluminum ribs. He wouldn't stop, his nose pressed to a single unremarkable panel in the floor, and behind it waited a secret sealed away for 20 years, a secret that would drag Elias back into a war he never chose and give him a reason to live again. If you've ever felt like you were at the end of your own road, comment a 1 below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The road to Mojave was a shimmering ribbon of heat and forgetting. Elias Thorne drove with the windows down, the dry air a scouring pad against his skin. Every mile erased a piece of the life he'd left behind. The empty house in Fort Bragg sold for a fraction of its worth. The curt letter from his ex-wife's lawyer. The last strained phone call with his daughter Maya, where the silence had said more than the words. He carried the war not in a rucksack, but in the architecture of his bones. It was the Korengal Valley, 2009, the smell of diesel and hot metal, the percussive cough of the SAW, the sudden world-ending concussion of the IED that had flipped their vehicle like a child's toy. He remembered the darkness, the taste of blood and dust, and then the frantic, determined weight of Buster, his Malinois, pulling him by the collar of his body armor, dragging him clear of the flames just before the fuel tank went. The dog had saved his life, and in the years since, he had anchored it. Now Buster slept in the passenger seat, his grizzled muzzle resting on the worn dash, his back leg twitching with dreams of his own. The dog had a matching set of scars along his flank, a permanent map of their shared history. When the flashbacks came for Elias, a sudden storm of noise and suffocating pressure, Buster would push his heavy head into his lap, a solid, living weight that held him in the present. The dog was the only thing that had come home with him intact, and even he was broken in his own way. They coasted into the town of Boron on fumes, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the desert. The boneyard was another 10 miles out, a sprawling graveyard of metal birds arranged in neat, silent rows under the unforgiving sun. Elias had found the listing on a surplus website, a single grainy photo and a price that seemed like a typo. 11 Boeing 727-200, as is, where is? Buyer responsible for removal or land lease. He wasn't removing it. He was moving in. The truck gave a final, shuddering gasp as he pulled up to a rust-streaked gate held shut by a heavy chain. An old man emerged from a corrugated metal shed, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag. His name was Gus, and his face was a roadmap of desert sun and skepticism. He looked from Elias's military-style haircut to the faded Ranger tab sticker on the truck's rear window, then to the alert, intelligent eyes of the dog watching him from the cab. "You're the fella from the internet," he stated, not asked. Elias nodded, pulling the worn bills from his wallet. $1,000, Elias said. Gus took the money, his eyes lingering on the cash for a moment, before tucking it into his shirt pocket. He looked back at the silent, hulking shape of the 727 at the far end of the lot, its paint peeled away by years of sand and sun, its engines long since stripped for parts. It was a ghost of a machine, a hollowed-out carcass. Gus was a man who didn't waste words, but as he worked the combination on the lock, he paused. "You know," he said, his voice a low rasp, "you're not the first one to show interest in that old bird." Elias waited, his senses on a low, steady hum of alert, a habit he'd never managed to break. He watched the way Gus didn't quite meet his eyes, instead focusing on the horizon. The desert was a place of secrets, a landscape that buried things and kept them buried. He knew that look. It was the look of a man who knew something he wasn't saying, a warning couched in casual conversation. The old man was a gatekeeper, not just to a boneyard, but to a story he didn't want to be a part of. Gus finally got the lock open, the metal groaning in protest. "Been a fella coming by for years," he continued, swinging the gate wide enough for the truck. "Real smooth type. Suit and tie, even out here. Drives a black pickup, clean as a whistle." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Always asking about this specific plane. Offered me 5 times what you're paying, just for the scrap rights. Said he represented some historical society." Gus squinted at Elias, his gaze sharp. "I never liked his eyes. Told him it wasn't for sale. Something about him. He wanted what was in it, not the plane itself. Seemed to think the previous owner left something behind." Elias felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the low-grade hum of his training switching from standby to active. He was just looking for a place to be left alone, a steel roof over his head that wouldn't leak, but trouble had a way of finding him, even at the end of the world. "Previous owner?" Elias asked, his voice deliberately level. "Some flyboy," Gus grunted, waving a hand dismissively. "Leased the spot for years, paid in cash, then just stopped. Mail came back. Phone disconnected. That was 20 years ago. Figured he was dead or just walked away. You're buying his debt, really. The plane is just the collateral." Gus handed him a set of keys for the gate. "Place is yours. Just don't go making a nuisance of yourself. And watch out for snakes." The warning felt like it applied to more than just the reptilian kind. As Elias drove the sputtering truck toward the hulking tri-jet, he saw Buster lift his head, his ears swiveling, his black nose testing the air. The dog knew something was different here. The air wasn't just dry, it was heavy with waiting. The first days were a lesson in survival. The Mojave sun turned the aluminum fuselage into an oven by midday, and the nights were cold enough to make his teeth ache. Elias was methodical, a creature of discipline. He sealed the cracked window panes with silicone, ran a small gas generator for a single work light and a hot plate, and set up his cot in the old first-class cabin, where the seats had been ripped out, leaving only the tracks in the floor. He and Buster established a routine: a long walk around the perimeter of the boneyard at dawn, work during the cooler morning hours, a long siesta during the peak heat, and another patrol at dusk. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind whistling through the empty engine nacelles and the distant cry of a hawk. It was the peace he'd been craving, a quiet so profound it felt like it could finally drown out the ringing in his ears. But on the second night, the peace shattered. He was trying to sleep when he heard it. A low, guttural growl from the back of the plane. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron he kept beside the cot. Buster was standing at the top of the short stairs that led down into the belly of the aircraft, his body rigid, the fur along his spine standing on end. He wasn't barking. It was worse than barking. It was a deep, sustained rumble of threat, aimed at something inside their own shelter. Elias clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Buster ignored him. He padded silently down the steps into the forward cargo hold, a cavernous space of exposed ribs and wiring. Elias followed, the beam of his light dancing across the corrugated floor. The dog went straight to a spot against the starboard wall, near the main cargo door, and stopped. He lowered his head, sniffing intently at a single, square floor panel, identical to all the others. Then he began to paw at it, his claws making a sharp, scraping sound on the metal. "Easy, Bus. Probably just a pack rat's nest under there." But Buster wouldn't stop. He grew more frantic, whining with a strange mix of agitation and purpose. He looked back at Elias, then back at the panel, a clear, desperate communication. This was not a rat. This was the same focused intensity the dog used when he'd found a pressure plate IED buried under a foot of packed earth. Elias knelt down, running his hand over the panel. It was cool to the touch, flush with the rest of the floor. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The surrounding panels returned a hollow, metallic ring. This one gave back a dull, solid thud. There was no echo. There was no space beneath it. Or rather, the space was already full. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Gus's words came back to him. He wanted what was in it, not the plane itself. He pressed his fingers into the seam, feeling for a latch or a release, but there was none. It was bolted down tight. Buster sat back on his haunches, his tail giving a single decisive thump against the floor. The dog had found something, and he would not let it go. The next morning, Elias went to work. He found a heavy-duty wrench in the truck's toolbox and attacked the bolts holding the panel in place. They were rusted solid, frozen by 2 decades of neglect. He spent an hour soaking them in penetrating oil, the acrid smell filling the cargo hold. While he waited, he examined the panel more closely. Along the edges, almost invisible under the grime, were faint scratches, the marks of a tool used to pry it up before. Someone had been in here, and whatever they'd put inside, they had sealed it up tight. Buster lay nearby, watching with an unnerving patience, his head on his paws, never taking his eyes off the spot. The dog's certainty was a physical presence in the space, a silent insistence that pushed back against Elias's own doubt. Finally, with a grunt of exertion and the full weight of his body on the wrench, the first bolt groaned and broke free. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. He worked on the other 3, each one a battle against time and rust. When the last one gave way, he wedged the tip of the tire iron into the seam and pried. The panel lifted with a shriek of tortured metal, revealing not the empty framework of the fuselage, but the flat, welded top of a steel box. It was custom-built, fitted perfectly into the space between the floor supports. A thick, ugly welding bead ran along all 4 sides of its lid. This wasn't storage. It was a vault. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the secret the man in the suit was looking for. This was the reason a forgotten plane in a desert boneyard had a ghost haunting it. He spent the rest of the day cutting through the weld. With a grinder, he powered off the generator, showering the dark hold with a fountain of orange sparks. The noise was deafening, the work brutal. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and fire, the last section of the weld gave way. He lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed foam padding, were 2 metal footlockers and a slim leather satchel. He opened the first locker. It was filled with vacuum-sealed bricks of $100 bills, bundled and stacked with military precision. The second held dozens of small velvet pouches. He opened one, and a cascade of rough, uncut diamonds spilled into his calloused palm, absorbing the last rays of twilight and holding them captive. It was a fortune, more money than he had ever imagined seeing in one place. But it was the leather satchel that drew his attention. Inside was a small, leather-bound flight engineer's logbook. He opened it. The last dozen pages were filled not with flight data, but with a hurried, handwritten script. The final entry was dated October 12th, 2003. This is the last run. Thorne said it was just electronics, but I saw what was in the crates. He's a monster, using this plane like a private bank vault. I can't be a part of it anymore. My name is Frank Coleman. I was a loadmaster in the Air Force, flew C-130s out of Ramstein. I never thought I'd end up here. I've hidden the payload in this log. It's my insurance, my testimony. If you're reading this, it means they got me. Don't trust Marcus Thorne. Don't let him have it. Use it to do some good. For God's sake, don't let him have it. Elias sat back on his heels, the weight of the dead man's words heavier than all the money and diamonds combined. Frank Coleman, a fellow veteran caught in something he couldn't fly away from. And Marcus Thorne, the name from the logbook. The smooth fella in the suit Gus had warned him about. The discovery wasn't an escape. It was a trap door, and he had just fallen through it. Buster nudged his hand, whining softly, as if he understood the gravity of what they had just unearthed. The secret was no longer buried. It was his. That night, sleep was a luxury Elias couldn't afford. He sat in the dark cockpit, the logbook open on his lap, the faint glow of his flashlight illuminating Frank Coleman's desperate words. He felt a strange kinship with the man, another soldier who had found himself on the wrong side of a war he hadn't understood until it was too late. Elias moved the footlockers and the satchel to a more secure hiding place, a small maintenance crawl space behind the cockpit wall, a spot not even a schematic would show. He put the floor panel back in place, scattering dust over it to make it look undisturbed. He was no longer just a man trying to disappear. He was a guardian. He was Frank Coleman's last line of defense. Just after midnight, Buster went rigid. He was staring out the cockpit window toward the distant dirt road that led to the boneyard, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Elias killed the flashlight and peered into the darkness. A pair of headlights appeared, slowing as they approached the gate. They didn't turn in. They just stopped, the engine a faint, throbbing hum on the night air. They sat there for a full 10 minutes, a silent, menacing presence in the vast emptiness. Elias's training took over. He wasn't Elias Thorne, broken veteran anymore. He was Master Sergeant Thorne, running threat assessments. One vehicle, at least one occupant. They're observing. They don't know I'm aware. They're testing the perimeter, looking for patterns. The headlights finally swept across the fence line and drove away, disappearing back the way they came. But the message was clear. They knew someone was here. The next morning, a sleek black pickup truck, exactly as Gus had described it, pulled up to the gate. A man in a tailored suit and polished shoes got out. He was tall, with silvering hair and a smile that was too bright for the dusty surroundings. He walked to the gate and called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Hello? Anyone here?" Elias came out of the plane, Buster at his side, the dog's posture a mirror of his own, watchful, coiled, ready. "Can I help you?" Elias said, his voice flat. He stopped a good 20 feet from the fence. "My name is Marcus Thorne," the man said, extending a hand that was never going to be shaken. "I'm with the Western Aviation Preservation Society. I understand you've taken possession of this 727. His eyes flicked past Elias, trying to see inside the plane's open door. "That is correct," Elias said, not offering his name. "Well, this is fantastic news. We've been trying to acquire this specific airframe for years for a museum exhibit. The previous owner was unreachable. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. Say $20,000? Cash. A handsome profit for you." Thorne's smile was a well-rehearsed piece of machinery. Buster didn't buy it. A low growl started deep in his chest. Elias rested a hand on the dog's neck. "She's not for sale." Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of cold anger in his eyes before it was replaced by practiced disappointment. "I see. Perhaps you'd reconsider. It's a historical artifact. It belongs in a museum, not out here." He looked around at the derelict planes with disdain. "I'll be in town for a few days, at the Boron Inn. Here's my card. Think about it." He slid a business card through the chain-link fence. Elias didn't move to take it. "I won't change my mind." Thorne's expression hardened. He looked down at Buster, a flicker of contempt on his face. "That's a fine-looking dog. Looks like he's seen some action." "We both have," Elias said, the words a clear warning. Thorne held his gaze for a long moment, the pretense of civility gone. It was a silent negotiation of threat. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. As he drove away, Elias knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning. The intrusion hadn't been an offer. It had been a reconnaissance. The business card lay in the dust where Thorne had dropped it. Elias left it there. He knew a declaration of war when he saw one. His isolation was no longer a refuge. It was a vulnerability. He needed information, and he needed supplies. The next morning, he drove the old Ford into Boron, leaving Buster on guard inside the locked fuselage of the 727. The dog seemed to understand, watching from the cockpit window with a solemn stillness until the truck disappeared from view. Boron was a one-street town with a diner, a gas station, and a handful of other businesses clinging to life. Elias went to the diner, a place called The Final Approach, its walls covered in faded photos of test pilots and military aircraft from nearby Edwards Air Force Base. A woman in her late 40s with tired, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor poured him a coffee without asking. "You're the one who bought the 727, she said. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a place this small. "I'm Sarah." Elias. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and black. "My dad, he was Gus's partner at the boneyard before he passed," Sarah said, wiping down the counter. "He always said there was something not right about that plane, about its last flight." Elias looked up, his gaze steady. He decided to take a calculated risk. "Did he ever mention a man named Frank Coleman?" Sarah's hand stilled. She put the rag down and looked at him, her expression shifting from friendly curiosity to guarded memory. "Frank. Yeah, I remember him. He was the flight engineer on that bird. Used to come in here for coffee when they were prepping it for storage. Quiet guy. Nice. Said he'd served in the Air Force." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "He disappeared right after that plane was parked. One day he was here, the next he was gone. His car was found at the bus station in Barstow, but no one ever saw him get on a bus. Everyone just figured he'd skipped out on something." And the flight itself? Elias prompted gently. It was supposed to be a simple ferry flight from a private airfield up north. Empty. But my dad, he worked the late shift that night. He swore he saw a truck, a big semi with no markings, meet the plane on the tarmac. He saw heavy crates being unloaded into the cargo hold after it was officially logged as decommissioned. He reported it to the old sheriff, but nothing ever came of it. The sheriff back then, he was friendly with a lot of powerful people. She looked out the window, toward the desert. My dad always said that plane was a tombstone. The net was tightening, drawing a line from a dead man to a corrupt sheriff to the smiling face of Marcus Thorne. When Elias left the diner, he noticed a black pickup truck parked across the street, the same model as Thorne's. It was too far away to see the driver, but he felt the weight of their gaze on his back. He wasn't just being watched anymore, he was being hunted. He spent the rest of his cash on a new burner phone, a high-powered flashlight, extra fuel for the generator, and a heavy-duty chain and padlock for the boneyard gate. As he was leaving the hardware store, he saw the lock he'd bought a few days prior had already been compromised. A faint, fresh scratch, almost invisible, marred the metal near the shackle. The mark of a pick gun. They had been inside the boneyard. They had been searching. They hadn't found what they were looking for, not yet, but they knew it was there. That night, he reread the final page of Frank Coleman's logbook. In the margin, next to his last desperate warning, was a set of numbers he hadn't noticed before, written so faintly they were almost part of the paper's grain. 34.9500 degrees north, 117.8000 degrees west. Coordinates. He punched them into the cheap mapping app on his new phone. The pin dropped onto a desolate spot in the middle of the desert, about 30 miles away. An abandoned mining claim, according to the map. A place to meet? A place to hide? Or the place where Frank Coleman's story had finally ended? It was a breadcrumb, left by a dead man, and Elias knew he had to follow it. The danger was no longer a matter of surveillance. It was physical, a palpable presence that pressed in on the thin aluminum walls of his sanctuary. Thorne knew he couldn't get what he wanted with polite offers. The time for subtlety was over. It came at dusk, 2 days later. Elias was outside, checking the perimeter, when Buster let out a sharp, urgent bark. 2 men were walking down the dirt road from the gate, which now stood wide open. They weren't wearing suits. They were dressed in work clothes, carrying tool bags, and they moved with a casual confidence that was more threatening than any open aggression. Elias met them halfway between the plane and the fence, Buster standing his ground beside him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Evening," the taller one said, a thin smile on his face. "Mr. Thorne sent us. He's worried about the condition of the aircraft. Said we should do a safety inspection, make sure it's secure." "It's secure," Elias said, his body angled, his hands loose at his sides. He could smell stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey on them. "We're just going to take a quick look inside. Won't take long," the other man said, taking a step forward. He had a heavy wrench in his hand. Elias didn't move. "I already told your boss it's not for sale, and you're not getting inside." The first man's smile vanished. "Look, old man, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." He dropped his tool bag, and a set of bolt cutters clattered to the ground. That was the signal. As the second man lunged, Elias moved. He wasn't a 62-year-old drifter anymore. He was a ranger, and the desert was his element. He sidestepped the clumsy swing of the wrench, using the man's momentum against him, and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. The man folded with a whoosh of expelled air. The taller one charged, but Buster was faster. The dog launched himself, a 70-pound projectile of muscle and teeth, clamping onto the man's forearm. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise, and swung wildly, trying to shake the dog off. In his other hand, a knife appeared, its blade glinting in the twilight. "Buster, out!" Elias commanded, but the man was already slashing. The blade caught Buster along his flank, the same side as his old scars. The dog yelped, a sound of pure agony that cut through Elias like shrapnel, and fell back, blood welling dark on his coat. A cold, precise rage settled over Elias. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. He moved past the man with the wrench, who was still gasping for breath on the ground, and closed the distance to the man with the knife in 3 quick strides. He broke the man's wrist with a sharp, brutal twist, the snap of bone echoing in the quiet air. The knife clattered to the ground. He followed with a series of disabling strikes, to the throat, the knee, the temple, not to kill, but to end the fight with absolute finality. The man crumpled into a heap. Elias went immediately to Buster. The cut was deep, a long, clean slice that was bleeding freely. He tore a strip from his own shirt and pressed it against the wound, murmuring to the dog in a low, steady voice. Buster licked his hand, his breathing ragged. The sight of his loyal friend, his only family, bleeding in the dust because of him, was the lowest point he'd reached. It was a pain worse than any flashback, worse than any loss. He had chosen this fight by staying. He had chosen to honor a dead man's last wish, and the cost was being paid by the one creature he'd sworn to protect. He worked quickly, using a first aid kit from the truck to clean and bandage the wound as best he could. Then, with the 2 intruders groaning on the ground, he used their own zip ties to bind their hands and feet. He wasn't calling the local sheriff. He was calling the FBI field office in Barstow, using the burner phone. He gave them his name, his former rank, and a simple, direct message. "I am a retired master sergeant at the Mojave Air and Spaceport Boneyard. I am holding 2 armed assailants who have trespassed on federal aviation property and assaulted me and my service animal. They claim to be working for a man named Marcus Thorne. I have evidence of a 20-year-old felony connected to this aircraft. I suggest you get here quickly." He sat with Buster, his hand resting on the dog's bandaged side, and waited. The war had come home, and he was going to finish it. The arrival of 2 black sedans from the FBI, their lights off until the last moment, was a quiet and efficient affair. The agents who stepped out were young, serious, and listened without interruption, as Elias laid out the facts in a calm, clipped monotone. He showed them the forced entry, the weapons, and the 2 subdued men. He told them about Marcus Thorne. He told them about Frank Coleman. Then, he led them into the cargo hold and showed them the hidden compartment. When he opened the footlockers, a reverent silence fell over the small group. One of the agents, a woman named Chen, looked from the money and diamonds to the logbook in Elias's hand. "He kept a record," Elias said simply, handing it to her. "Coleman. He knew this day might come." The 2 hired thugs, faced with a litany of federal charges, started talking before they were even in the car. Their story corroborated everything. They worked for Thorne's logistics company, a front that was looking more and more like a massive smuggling and money laundering operation. Marcus Thorne was arrested at the Baron Inn before sunrise. He maintained his arrogant composure until Agent Chen laid Frank Coleman's logbook on the interview table in front of him. The sight of the dead man's handwriting seemed to finally break him. The story that unraveled was one of greed, and murder. The diamonds were from a heist in Los Angeles, and Thorne had used the decommissioned 727 with the help of a coerced Frank Coleman to fly them out of state, hidden among legitimate cargo. He'd planned to kill Coleman all along, but the flight engineer had been smarter than he thought. Coleman had hidden the real payload and the logbook, creating a dummy set of crates for Thorne's men to unload, then vanished. Thorne had been searching for his lost fortune for 20 years, buying influence with the local authorities, waiting, always watching the plane, the one loose end he could never tie up. The coordinates in the logbook led investigators to a shallow grave in the desert. Frank Coleman finally came home. Elias gave his official statement, his words precise and factual. When it was over, Agent Chen handed him a card. A significant portion of the recovered assets will be subject to forfeiture, but there's also a finder's fee provision, a substantial one. It will take time, but it's yours. You earned it. Elias just nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. He looked over at Buster, who was now resting on a blanket in the back of Sarah's truck. She had come out as soon as she heard the sirens, her face etched with worry, and had insisted on taking Buster to a vet she knew and trusted in the next town. The money didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet man who had died in the desert, and the loyal dog breathing shallowly on a faded blanket. The reckoning had come, but the cost felt immense. Later that week, after Buster was back, stitched up and moving stiffly but alive, Elias stood in the open doorway of the 727, looking out at the desert. He held a letter in his hand. It was from his daughter, Maya. His story had made the national news, a quirky human interest piece that had snowballed into a major federal investigation. "Dad," it began, "I saw you on the news. I was so worried and so proud. Please call me. I want to hear your voice." The place he had come to disappear had made him visible to the whole world, and to the one person he thought he had lost forever. He hadn't found a place to die. He had found a place to start again. He had honored the dead, and in doing so had found a way back to the living. The unfinished purpose of Frank Coleman had become his own. It wasn't about the money. It was about the debt. A debt to a fellow soldier, and a debt to himself. A year later, the 727 no longer looked like a ghost. A fresh coat of white paint gleamed in the sun, and solar panels arrayed on the massive wings powered a small, self-sufficient homestead that had grown up around it. The interior of the plane had been converted into a clean, functional living space, with a workshop, a small library, and several quiet rooms. It was called the Coleman Project, a sanctuary for veterans who, like Elias, had run out of road. Using the substantial finder's fee, he had purchased the boneyard from a now-retired Gus and established a foundation in Frank Coleman's name. It provided temporary housing, counseling, and job training for men and women trying to find their footing after the military. Sarah from the diner was a frequent visitor, bringing supplies and her own brand of tough, practical friendship. She managed the foundation's finances, her sharp mind ensuring that every dollar was accounted for. Buster, now fully healed though with a new, distinguished scar to add to his collection, spent his days as the unofficial camp commander, greeting newcomers with a calm, discerning sniff and spending his evenings asleep at Elias's feet. The biggest change was the sound of a voice on the phone. Elias and Maya spoke every week. The calls were hesitant at first, navigating the minefield of years of silence, but they were growing easier. She was planning to visit, to see the strange new life her father had built for himself among the metal ghosts of the desert. She was proud of him. Those were words he never thought he'd hear again. He often sat in the cockpit at sunset, The same spot where he'd first felt the cold grip of fear and read from Frank Coleman's logbook. He read it to the new arrivals, not the parts about the crime, but the parts about flying, about service, about feeling lost and wanting to find a way home. He was continuing the dead man's flight. What had looked like an ending, a final, desperate retreat into the oblivion of the desert, had become a beginning. The $1,000 he had spent on a metal shell had bought him a new mission. The dog who had refused to let a secret lie had unearthed his soul. He was no longer Master Sergeant Thorne, haunted by the Korangal. He was just Elias, a man with a purpose, a man who offered a quiet place for other wounded soldiers to land. The inverted closing was now his life. The place he came to disappear became the place that saved him, all because of a loyal dog who knew, long before he did, that something vital was buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be found.